In the sun-scorched valleys of the Arabian Peninsula, amid the shifting sands and rugged mountains, there lived a man whose name would echo through the centuries, a man whose very presence on the battlefield seemed to bend the course of destiny. His name was Khalid ibn al-Walid, remembered by his followers as the Sword of Allah, and remembered by his enemies as an unstoppable force, a commander who turned defeat into triumph and reshaped the fate of empires. To understand him, one must begin not in the age of his glory, but in the years before Islam had risen from the deserts of Arabia, when tribal loyalties defined the map and survival was a daily struggle. Khalid was born into the powerful Quraysh tribe of Mecca, a clan bound by tradition, wealth and influence. His father, al-Walid ibn al-Mughira, was a man of prestige, and young Khalid grew up in an environment steeped in tribal pride and martial discipline. From his earliest years, he was trained in horsemanship, archery, and swordsmanship, the very arts that defined the worth of an Arab nobleman. He was taught not only how to wield a blade, but also how to master the desert itself, how to read its shifting winds, how to endure the merciless heat, and how to turn scarcity into strength. For a boy of his lineage, war was not simply a possibility, it was an expectation. The Mecca of Khalid's youth was a city of contradictions, a place of religious devotion to the Kaaba, yet also one of fierce resistance to new ideas. When Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, began to preach a message of monotheism, it was Khalid's tribe that led the opposition. In these early years, Khalid found himself on the opposite side of history, a warrior fighting against the very faith he would one day defend. At the Battle of Uhud, he displayed the brilliance that would later make him legendary. Leading the Quraysh cavalry, he executed a decisive maneuver that turned the tide of battle against the Muslims, transforming what had been a near victory for Muhammad's followers into a bitter defeat. It was the kind of battlefield instinct that marked him as a natural general, a commander who could sense the weakness of his enemy and strike with precision. But fate has a way of bending the arc of even the strongest men. The very skills that made Khalid the scourge of the Muslims would one day make him their champion. In the years that followed Uhud, Islam grew in strength, forging alliances and winning hearts. Khalid, like many of his peers, watched the tide shift. The conquest of Mecca, the transformation of Arabia under the banner of Islam, these events forced him to question his place in the world. For a man of honor, loyalty was a sacred bond, but there was also the call of destiny, the realization that truth cannot be fought forever. When Khalid embraced Islam, it was as though a new fire had been kindled within him. The Prophet Muhammad, recognizing the potential of this warrior, bestowed upon him a title that no other man in history would bear, Saif Allah, the Sword of God. It was both a blessing and a burden, a recognition that his skills in war would now serve a divine purpose. The man who had once wielded his sword against Islam now carried it as the shield of the faith. From that moment, the arc of his life became intertwined with the rise of a new civilization, one that would stretch far beyond the sands of Arabia. The Ridda Wars that followed the Prophet Muhammad's death tested the young Muslim community to its very core. Tribes across Arabia, some loyal only to Muhammad's personal authority, rebelled in waves, threatening to tear apart what had been so painstakingly built. It was in this crucible of crisis that Khalid ibn al-Walid emerged as the decisive commander. At the Battle of Yamama, facing the forces of Musaylima, the false prophet, Khalid showed the ruthless determination that would define his campaigns. The fighting was fierce, the stakes nothing less than the survival of Islam itself. Khalid reorganized his men, rallied their courage, and led them into a storm of blood and steel until the rebellion was crushed. It was a victory that not only preserved the Muslim community, but also proved Khalid's unmatched ability to lead men through the darkest of trials. What made Khalid unique was not merely his courage, for Arabia had never been short of brave warriors. It was his vision, his understanding of strategy, his ability to adapt and innovate where others faltered. He mastered the use of speed and surprise, employing swift cavalry strikes that bewildered his enemies. He understood the psychology of war, knowing when to inspire his men with hope and when to break his opponents with fear. He was not simply a commander of armies, he was a commander of hearts and minds. Yet Khalid's story is not one of triumph without cost. The battlefield leaves scars, not only on bodies but on souls. The men who fought under him faced hardship, hunger, and exhaustion, and Khalid himself carried the weight of every life lost, every sacrifice made. War was his calling, but it was also his burden. Still, in each campaign, he carried forward with unshakable resolve, convinced that his path was not merely the pursuit of victory, but the fulfillment of a destiny written in the sands of time. As the Arabian Peninsula fell under the banner of Islam, new horizons opened before Khalid. The great empires of Byzantium and Persia loomed to the north, their armies vast, their histories stretching back centuries. To challenge them seemed unthinkable, yet it was into their lands that Khalid would march, leading armies that were small in number but great in spirit. These campaigns would not only test his genius, but also rewrite the map of the ancient world. The deserts had forged him, the prophet had named him, and now history awaited him. Thus begins the saga of Khalid ibn al-Walid, the greatest general in history. A man whose life was a testament to the power of faith, strategy, and unyielding will. His story does not belong to one people or one era alone, but to all who marvel at the resilience of the human spirit and the timeless art of war. His journey was far from over, and the world would soon learn that when the sword of God was unsheathed, no empire could stand in its path. The shadow of empire lay before the Muslims like a daunting horizon, the twin powers of Byzantium and Persia towering as giants over the known world. For centuries, these two had clashed across deserts and plains, exhausting themselves in endless wars that left their borders frayed and their peoples weary. Into this crucible of imperial fatigue rode Khalid ibn al-Walid, leading armies that by all traditional measures should have been too small, too inexperienced, too lightly equipped to challenge the great powers of the age. Yet what they lacked in numbers, they possessed in spirit, and what they lacked in equipment, they found in strategy. Khalid was the fulcrum, the man who could turn weakness into advantage, who could forge a path where none seemed possible. It began with the Persian frontier. Arabia pressed against the fertile lands of Iraq, the heart of the Sassanid world. The Persians, heirs to centuries of imperial tradition, commanded vast resources, cataphracts clad in heavy armor, and the legacy of kings who claimed descent from the ancients. Against them marched Khalid, with a force of Arabs bound not by imperial pay but by faith, men hardened by the desert and unified by belief. The early encounters were not mere skirmishes, but lessons in contrast, a clash of civilizations on uneven ground. At the Battle of Ulais, the Persians assembled a formidable host, confident in their numbers and discipline. Khalid met them not with hesitation, but with audacity, leading a ferocious assault that shattered their lines. When the battle was over, the field was thick with the fallen, and Khalid had earned a reputation that spread far beyond Arabia. But victory alone was not enough. Khalid understood that campaigns are not won only by the sword, but by the mind. He moved swiftly, striking before his enemies could regroup, turning each success into momentum. Towns that resisted were subdued, and those that surrendered found terms of mercy, a policy that contrasted sharply with the ruthless reputation of the empires. Khalid's strategy was one of relentless movement, never allowing the Persians time to gather their strength. He was not merely fighting battles, he was dismantling an empire's confidence piece by piece. It was during this campaign that Khalid undertook one of the most extraordinary feats in military history. Summoned urgently to Syria, where the Byzantines were pressing hard against the Muslims, Khalid faced the challenge of moving his army across the Arabian desert, a stretch of barren wilderness so desolate that no general in his right mind would attempt it. Yet Khalid was no ordinary general. He gathered his men, prepared supplies, and set out on a march that would become legend. With discipline and ingenuity, he led his army through the waterless expanse, timing their movement with precision, conserving resources, and maintaining morale. When he emerged on the other side, his enemies could scarcely believe it. He had not only defied nature, but also outflanked the Byzantines, appearing where they least expected him, a phantom of the desert whose movements defied logic. The arrival of Khalid in Syria marked a turning point. The Byzantines, heirs to Rome, commanded legions of trained soldiers, fortified cities, and the prestige of 1,000 years of empire. Yet they now faced a commander whose methods defied their conventions. At Ajnadain, the two forces met in battle, and it was here that Khalid's genius shone. He maneuvered his cavalry with surgical precision, using feigned retreats and sudden charges to break the cohesion of the Byzantine ranks. The battlefield became a theater of deception and speed, and by the day's end, the Byzantines had suffered a crushing defeat. These victories were not the result of chance or luck. They were the fruits of a mind that understood war as both science and art. Khalid knew the value of terrain, the power of timing, and the psychology of fear. He could read the flow of battle as though it were a living thing, anticipating his enemy's moves and countering them with swiftness. Yet he was also a man of immense personal bravery, never removed from the danger of combat, always in the thick of the fight where his men could see him, drawing courage from his presence. For them he was not only a commander, but a living symbol of divine favor. But to grasp the scale of Khalid's impact, one must look beyond individual battles. His campaigns were reshaping the map of the world. The Muslim armies, once confined to Arabia, were now carving out a presence in lands that had been the heartlands of empire. In each victory, the balance of power shifted, and with each conquest the reputation of Khalid grew. He was no longer merely a tribal warrior from Mecca. He was a general whose name struck fear into the hearts of kings and emperors. What set him apart from other conquerors of history was the speed of his achievements. In less than a decade, he transformed the position of the Muslims from vulnerable newcomers on the world stage into a force capable of humbling two superpowers. His campaigns in Iraq and Syria were not isolated triumphs, but parts of a larger vision, a relentless momentum that pushed outward, challenging the notion that the old empires were unassailable. Khalid was proving day by day that the age of Persia and Byzantium was passing, and a new chapter was beginning. Yet even in the midst of such success, Khalid remained a figure of paradox. He was both merciless and merciful, fierce in battle, yet often magnanimous to the defeated. He was a man whose life was bound to war, but who fought not for plunder or empire, but for a cause he believed transcended himself. And though he became the sword of Islam, his loyalty was not to ambition or personal glory, but to the community he served. The stage was set for even greater confrontations. The Persians would not yield so easily, and the Byzantines, stung by defeat, marshaled their forces for a reckoning. Ahead lay some of the greatest battles of late antiquity, moments when the fate of entire civilizations would hang in the balance. And at the center of it all stood Khalid ibn al-Walid, a man who seemed to embody the will of destiny itself, a commander whose presence made the impossible attainable. The desert had shaped him, the prophet had named him, and now history itself would test him on the grandest scale. The clash between the Muslims and Byzantium grew into a struggle that would determine the destiny of the Near East. The victories of Khalid in Syria had shaken the confidence of the empire, but the Byzantines were not yet broken. They gathered their strength, marshalling armies from across their provinces, determined to crush the rising force that threatened their dominion. At the heart of this looming confrontation was a single truth. Khalid ibn al-Walid stood as the linchpin of the Muslim advance, the commander whose genius could tip the balance against an empire that had withstood centuries of invasion. The campaigns in Syria became a test not only of arms but of endurance and will. Khalid's arrival had electrified the Muslim armies, who now faced opponents larger in number and heavier in armor. The Byzantines fought not merely as soldiers of an empire, but as defenders of their faith and civilization. Against them, Khalid wielded his mastery of maneuver, his cavalry moving like shadows across the battlefield, striking with devastating precision before vanishing into the dust. The Muslims, lean and hardened by desert life, fought with a spirit their adversaries found difficult to comprehend. At Fal, near the Jordan River, the Byzantines made a stand in terrain that seemed to favor them. The marshy ground was treacherous for cavalry, yet Khalid turned disadvantage into opportunity. He feigned weakness, drawing his enemy forward into the reeds, and when the moment was right, unleashed a counter-strike that shattered their formation. It was a pattern that repeated itself again and again, Khalid inviting overconfidence, then punishing it with a fury that left his foes in disarray. Each victory carved deeper into Byzantine resolve, while the legend of Khalid grew among both friend and foe. But all of these battles were preludes to the storm that would come. The Emperor Heraclius, ruler of Byzantium, was not a man to surrender lightly. From his throne in Antioch, he called upon the resources of his empire to raise a vast army, determined to drive the Muslims from Syria once and for all. The gathering of forces was immense, soldiers drawn from across Anatolia, Armenia, and beyond. The sheer scale of it dwarfed anything the Muslims had yet faced. For Heraclius, this was more than a campaign, it was a crusade of survival. The Muslims scattered in garrisons across Syria knew that the storm was coming. It was Khalid who once again became the binding force. He recalled his troops, regrouped their numbers, and prepared to face the might of Byzantium. The chosen ground was a plain near the Yarmouk River, a place where the destiny of nations would be decided. There, in the year 636, armies converged in one of the most decisive battles of late antiquity. The numbers seemed hopeless. Byzantine forces, by some accounts, numbered well over 100,000, while Khalid commanded perhaps a fraction of that. Yet he understood that numbers alone do not decide the outcome of war. Discipline, morale, and leadership mattered more than raw strength. He organized his men into ranks that could withstand the first blows of the Byzantine charge, and behind them, his cavalry waited like coiled serpents, ready to strike when the moment came. For 6 days, the battle raged with ferocity. The Byzantines pressed their advantage, their lines crashing against the Muslims with the weight of an empire behind them. But Khalid was everywhere, riding across the battlefield, directing charges, rallying the weary, and exploiting every hesitation in the enemy's ranks. He divided his cavalry into mobile detachments, striking at Byzantine flanks, cutting off reinforcements, and sowing confusion. His men fought with the desperation of those who knew there was no retreat, for behind them lay only the desert. The Byzantines, despite their numbers, found themselves trapped in a dance choreographed by Khalid's mind. Their movements anticipated and countered at every turn. On the final day, he launched a massive cavalry assault that swept around the enemy, driving them toward the cliffs of the Yarmouk Gorge. What began as a retreat became a rout, and what became a rout turned into slaughter. Thousands of Byzantines were cut down, their empire's hopes of reclaiming Syria shattered in a single, cataclysmic defeat. The victory at Yarmouk was more than a battle won. It was a world transformed. With that triumph, the Byzantine hold over the Levant was broken. Cities that had once seemed impregnable opened their gates, and the empire withdrew northward. Its centuries-long dominance of the region ended. For Khalid, it was the pinnacle of his military genius, the culmination of years of campaigns in which speed, intelligence, and audacity had turned weakness into strength. No general in history had accomplished so much, so quickly, against such overwhelming odds. And yet, even in triumph, Khalid remained restless. The war against Byzantium was not his only struggle. To the east, the Persians still resisted, their empire battered but not destroyed. Khalid had already humbled them in Iraq, but the task of breaking their power once and for all still remained. He was a man caught between fronts, a commander whose presence was demanded everywhere at once. Yet wherever he went, the tide seemed to shift with him. His men called him the Sword of God, and on the lips of his enemies, his name was spoken with fear, as though he were more than a man, a force of nature unleashed upon the world. But Khalid was a man, and like all men, he was bound by time, by the politics of those he served, and by the fragile bonds of trust that defined his relationship with the caliphs in Medina. His brilliance, though unmatched on the battlefield, often stirred unease among those who feared any single man becoming too powerful. Even as he won victories that secured the survival of the young Muslim state, whispers and doubts grew in the halls of power. For Khalid, the greatest battles of his life were not always fought against the legions of empires, but sometimes against the suspicions of his own leaders. Still, the story of Yarmouk endures as a testament to his genius, a moment when the course of history bent beneath the will of one commander and the courage of an outnumbered army. The desert-born warrior who once led Quraysh cavalry against the Muslims had now become the architect of Islam's ascendancy over empires, and the map of the Near East would never be the same again. From the sands of Arabia to the banks of the Yarmouk, Khalid ibn al-Walid had carved his name into the chronicles of history with the edge of his sword. The dust of Yarmouk had barely settled when the consequences of Khalid's victory became clear. The Byzantine Empire, once a towering force that had stood against Persians, Huns, and countless others, now found itself retreating from lands it had held for centuries. Syria, the jewel of the eastern provinces, was slipping from its grasp, and with each city that fell, the reach of the Muslim community expanded. Yet even as Khalid rode in triumph through the Levant, the complexities of leadership in Medina cast a shadow over his future. The battlefield had made him indispensable, but politics would test him in ways no army ever had. In Medina, Caliph Abu Bakr, who had trusted Khalid implicitly and recognized his unmatched abilities, had passed from the world. His successor, Umar ibn al-Khattab, was a man of stern principles, a leader of immense vision and discipline, but one who harbored reservations about the concentration of fame and loyalty in any single commander. Umar admired Khalid's skills, yet feared that such brilliance might foster dependence among the Muslim armies, or worse, inspire the seeds of pride. To Umar, Islam was not the triumph of one man's sword, but the collective struggle of a people bound by faith. Thus, even as Khalid secured victory after victory, Umar resolved to curtail his dominance. The decision came as a shock. In the midst of the Syrian campaigns, with the fate of the frontiers still uncertain, Umar removed Khalid from supreme command. The man who had led armies to improbable triumphs, who had struck fear into the empires of the age, was suddenly ordered to step aside. The appointment of Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah as commander marked a shift not in military strategy, but in political balance. For many it seemed unthinkable that the sword of God should be sheathed at such a moment. Yet Khalid accepted the order with the discipline of a soldier loyal not to his own ambition, but to the cause he served. He fought on as a subordinate, his presence still electrifying the battlefield, but now under the authority of another. This humility, rare among conquerors of history, revealed something profound about Khalid's character. Though he had every reason to resent the decision, he placed the unity of the community above his own pride. He continued to lead charges, to devise strategies, to inspire men, but he did so without the trappings of supreme command. His loyalty was not to glory, but to the faith that had transformed him. For the soldiers who followed him, the change in title mattered little. Khalid remained their inspiration, the commander whose instincts never failed them. The campaigns pressed onward. After Yarmouk, the Muslim armies advanced steadily through Syria and Palestine. Damascus, the ancient city of the Levant, fell after a determined siege, and Khalid played a central role in its capture. Later, at Chinasrin, his forces faced resistance from a Byzantine garrison determined to hold its ground. Khalid met them with his characteristic ferocity, breaking their defenses and securing the city. Each conquest solidified Muslim control and weakened Byzantine influence, and though his official position had changed, Khalid's mark on these victories was unmistakable. Beyond Syria, the Persian front continued to demand attention. Khalid had already humbled their forces in earlier campaigns, but the empire remained formidable, its rulers determined to reclaim lost ground. Though much of Khalid's later career centered in Syria, his earlier victories in Iraq laid the groundwork for the eventual collapse of Sassanid power. His campaigns there demonstrated a mastery of maneuver that exploited the weaknesses of Persian heavy cavalry, using speed and surprise to offset the disparity in equipment. By the time the Muslims delivered their final blows against Persia at Qadisiyah and Nahavand, Khalid's earlier work had already eroded the empire's confidence and capacity to resist. Yet, as the years wore on, Khalid's personal fortunes shifted. He was admired by soldiers, feared by enemies, and respected by commanders, but the suspicions of Umar never fully abated. In Medina, whispers circulated about the scale of wealth Khalid distributed, the gifts he gave, and the loyalty he commanded. Umar, vigilant against any semblance of personal cult or corruption, recalled Khalid once more, this time removing him entirely from command. For the sword of God, this was the final test of obedience. He returned without rebellion, his honor intact, his reputation untarnished among the men who had followed him through so many trials. To understand the magnitude of this moment, one must imagine what it meant for a general of such stature, a man whose name had become synonymous with victory, to be cast aside not in defeat, but in triumph. Many commanders in history, deprived of power, would have turned to rebellion or sought to carve out their own dominion. Khalid did neither. He accepted his dismissal with dignity, retreating from the stage of command but leaving behind a legacy that required no further proof. In the annals of history, his victories spoke louder than titles, and his campaigns stood as monuments to his genius. The remainder of his life was lived in quietude compared to the thunder of his earlier years. He settled in Homs, a city in Syria that bore witness to his last days. Deprived of the battlefield, he carried with him the memories of countless campaigns, the weight of lives taken and saved, the scars of wounds that never fully healed. Yet what tormented him most was not the loss of power, but the fact that he would die not as a martyr on the battlefield, but in his bed, a fate he lamented. For a man whose existence had been intertwined with combat, whose body bore the marks of more than 100 wounds, death in peace felt almost like a betrayal of his calling. Still, Khalid's life was not defined by its end, but by its impact. His campaigns had ensured the survival and expansion of the Muslim community in its most vulnerable years. His strategies had humbled empires, his courage had inspired armies, and his loyalty had preserved unity in moments of division. When he passed, he left behind not an empire of his own, but a legacy that belonged to a civilization. His sword was laid to rest, but his name remained etched into the memory of generations. The paradox of Khalid ibn al-Walid is that he was both indispensable and expendable, a man whose victories made history, yet whose humility allowed him to fade without tearing apart the community he had served. He was the greatest general of his age, and perhaps of any age, not only because he won battles, but because he embodied the discipline of a soldier who served something greater than himself. And though he died in obscurity compared to the splendor of emperors and kings, his influence endured far beyond theirs. For empires rise and fall, but the legacy of a man who reshapes history endures as long as memory itself. The life of Khalid ibn al-Walid ended not with the clash of swords but with silence, and yet his story did not fade with him. It lived on in the memory of those who had followed him across deserts and through fire, in the chronicles of historians who marveled at his campaigns, and in the whispers of his enemies who could never forget the terror of facing him. To speak of Khalid is to speak of a man who stood at the crossroads of history, where ancient empires gave way to new civilizations, where the old world collapsed and the new was born. His name became inseparable from the triumph of Islam's earliest conquests, and his reputation stretched far beyond the boundaries of Arabia and Syria. Generals across the centuries have been measured against his standard. His use of speed, deception, and psychological warfare anticipates the methods of commanders many centuries later. When modern strategists study the art of maneuver, when they speak of mobility and shock as decisive factors in war, they unknowingly echo Khalid's principles. He was a master of the cavalry charge, but more than that, he was a master of timing. He knew when to retreat and when to strike, when to feign weakness and when to unleash fury. His genius lay not only in the moves he made, but in the way he read the mind of his opponent, seeing the battle not as chaos but as a pattern waiting to be unraveled. And yet his story is not merely one of tactics and strategy. Khalid embodied the paradox of war and faith. He was a man of relentless violence, whose sword carved the destiny of nations, and yet he fought not for personal empire, but for a cause he believed was greater than himself. Unlike Alexander or Caesar, he did not seek crowns or monuments. He amassed no wealth for his own glory. When he died, he left little behind but his weapons, his horse, and the memory of his deeds. In this, his legacy differs from the conquerors of antiquity. His greatness lay not in the empire he built, but in the victories that preserved and expanded a faith destined to endure long after the empires of his enemies crumbled into dust. In the centuries that followed, the world remembered Khalid in many ways. Among Muslims, he became a figure of awe, a symbol of divine favor, the very sword of God unsheathed in defense of the faith. His campaigns were recounted in poetry and prose, his victories told as lessons in courage and resolve. Among his enemies, he was remembered with a mixture of fear and respect. Byzantine chronicles lamented his brilliance, acknowledging that the disaster at Yarmouk was the work of a commander unlike any they had faced. For the Persians, his lightning strikes across their borders were the harbingers of the empire's decline, a reminder that even the proudest dynasty could be humbled by the relentless will of a single man. Modern historians, when weighing the greatest generals in history, often turn to names like Hannibal, Napoleon, or Genghis Khan. Each carved their place with extraordinary victories and reshaped the world around them. But Khalid ibn al-Walid stands among them as a unique figure, for he never tasted defeat in the field of battle. From the day he first commanded in the Ridda Wars to his final campaign in Syria, his record remained unbroken. No ambush caught him unprepared, no enemy outmaneuvered him, no siege exhausted his will. In the long history of warfare, this record is unmatched, and it elevates him into a category of his own. But perhaps his most enduring legacy lies not in his victories but in his humility. Removed from command, stripped of authority, and denied the chance to end his life as a martyr in battle, Khalid accepted his fate without rebellion. He had the loyalty of armies, the adoration of soldiers, and the reputation to challenge any rival. Yet he never turned his sword against the leadership of the community. In this lies the measure of his greatness, that he knew when to fight and when to stand down, when to unleash his strength and when to accept the will of others. For a man who could have taken power by force, his refusal to do so speaks louder than his victories. The legacy of Khalid ibn al-Walid is also the legacy of transition. He lived in an age when the old order was collapsing. The Byzantines and Persians, weary from their centuries of rivalry, faced a new power that rose from the deserts of Arabia. Khalid was the sharp edge of that rise, the man who ensured that Islam survived its infancy and spread beyond its birthplace. His campaigns opened the gates of Syria, Iraq, and beyond, creating the conditions for a civilization that would flourish in science, art, and philosophy. Without Khalid, the early Muslim community might have faltered under the pressure of rebellion and foreign threat. With him, it became unstoppable. In the quiet of his final days, Khalid is said to have lamented that he would die in bed, though he bore the wounds of countless battles. He had lived for war, and to pass into death without the clash of steel seemed to him a cruel irony. Yet perhaps there was a deeper truth in this ending. The man who never lost a battle, who seemed invincible on the field, was reminded that even the greatest general cannot conquer time. His death in peace symbolized the transition from the age of conquest to the age of consolidation, from the storm of war to the building of civilization. And so his story closes, not with the triumphal march of armies, but with the silence of a man laid to rest in the soil of Syria, the land he had won with his sword. His grave became a place of memory, his name a banner carried by those who sought inspiration in later centuries. Warriors, rulers, and scholars alike looked back to him as a model of courage, brilliance, and devotion. His life was a reminder that history is shaped not only by kings and emperors, but by men whose genius and resolve bend the fate of nations. Today, when we reflect on the greatest generals in history, when we weigh their deeds and measure their legacies, Khalid ibn al-Walid stands as more than a figure of the past. He is a reminder of the power of faith married to skill, of courage tempered by humility, of destiny shaped by will. His victories reshaped the world of his time, but his character continues to inspire across ages. The sword of God may have been sheathed in death, but its echo rings on, a testament to a man who was in every sense the greatest general in history.